Once Einish's skull was securely shut in the cage of mesquite branches, Tudwal reached in and offered to cut the thongs that bound his hands and feet. Skull had been stripped naked, too. Both the binding and the stripping were indignities he didn't appreciate, though he maintained a cheerful demeanor throughout. "Stick your feet over near the bars and I'll cut you loose," Tudwal offered. "Then I'll do your hands. You won't be able to catch no pigeons with your hands tied like that. You'd starve in 10 days, which ain't what he has in mind. When he hangs a man in a cage, he expects him to last a while." "I have never cared much for squab," Skull said. "I suppose I can learn to like it if there's nothing else." "A Mexican we hung off this cliff caught an eagle once," Tudwal said. "But the eagle got the best of him, pecked out one of his eyes." "I notice you blink, sir. What happened?" Skull said. "A sparrow get you?" "Nothing. I was just born a-blinking," Tudwal said. The insult, as Skull had feared, didn't register. "But you weren't born in Mexico," Skull said. "You sound to me like a man who was probably born in Cincinnati or thereabouts." Tudwal was startled. How did the man know that? He had, in fact, been born on the Kentucky River not far from Cincinnati. "You're right, Captain, but how'd you know that?" Tudwal asked. "I suppose it's your mellow tone," Skull said. He smiled at the man, hoping to lull him into a moment of inattention. The cliff they were about to lower him over seemed to fall away for a mile. Once they lowered him, his fate would be sealed. He would hang there in space with half of Mexico to look at until he froze or starved. He didn't relish hanging there for days or weeks, surviving on the occasional bird he could yank through the bars. Ahumado, an old Mayan come north to prey on ignorant people, white and brown, had not proved susceptible to Harvard charm. But Tudwal, the blinking man, did not seem overly intelligent. If he kept talking, he might yet fool him into making a mistake. He had obediently held his feet near the bars, and Tudwal had freed his ankles. His wrists came next, and there lay the opportunity. Tudwal looked puzzled when Skull mentioned the mellow tone. Actually, the man had a nasal voice with little mellowness in it. "Yes, sir. I've been sung too often by Ohio maidens. Some of them may not quite have been maidens at the time. The whores in the fine town of Cincinnati have lullabied me to sleep many times. Have you heard this old tune, sir?" He struck up the old ballad of Barbara Allen. "There was a fair maid dwelling in London town where I was born. There was a fair maid dwelling." Tudwal nodded. Someone far back in his life had once sung that song, a grandmother or an aunt, he was not sure. He forgot for a moment that Captain Skull was about to be dangled to his death. The song took him away, into memory, into thoughts of his mother and his sister when he had led a gentler life. As Skull sang, he held his hands close to the bars so that Tudwal could cut the rawhide thongs. He sang softly so that Tudwal would lean forward as he cut. The moment the bonds parted, Skull grabbed Tudwal's wrist and whacked it so hard against the mesquite bars that he broke it. The knife fell into the cage. He had one weapon. Then he caught Tudwal by the throat and pulled him close enough to the cage that he could reach with the other hand and yank the man's Colt pistol out of its holster. Now he had two weapons. He would have preferred to conserve bullets by strangling Tudwal, but the man was too strong. Before Skull could get his other hand on Tudwal's throat, he twisted away, forcing Skull to shoot him dead, the sound echoing through the yellow canyon. The four dark men who had been waiting to lower the cage immediately took their machetes and trotted away. Ahumado was still back at the crater where the feast was being held, waiting on his blanket. He would have heard the shot. "There, you Cincinnati fool, I warbled you to death," Skull said. His situation had improved dramatically. He had a knife and a gun and 5 bullets. On the other hand, he was in a flimsy cage on top of a 500-foot cliff, and he was naked. The bindings that held the mesquite cage together were hardened rawhide. Skull began to hack at them, but the knife was dull and the rawhide hard as iron. Tudwal's horse stood near. If he could cut himself free, he might have a chance, but the rawhide was so resistant and the knife so dull that it might take an hour to free himself. and he didn't have an hour. "You goddamned fool, why didn't you sharpen your knife?" Skull said. "Not only did you have a Cincinnati voice, you had a goddamned weak Kentucky brain." It annoyed him. He had worked a miracle, killed his captor, and yet he wasn't free. Then, with a moment to breathe, he remembered another of Papa Franklin's fine sayings: "Haste makes waste." He looked more closely at the jointure of the wrappings. He didn't need to hack the cage apart. If he could just break the wrappings at one corner of the cage, he could squeeze out and run. He still had 5 bullets. It seemed good policy to sacrifice 1 or 2 of them to free himself. He immediately tested the decision and was well pleased with the result. 2 bullets and the wrappings blew apart, and he squeezed through and stood up. His fighting spirit rose. By God, he was out! He squatted briefly over the body of Tudwall, but found only 2 more bullets in a pocket of the man's dirty tunic. But the man at least wore clothes. Skull hastily stripped him and pulled on his filthy pants and tunic. They were too large, but they were clothes. The paint horse stood not 30 feet away. Its ears were up. It looked at Skull nervously. "Steady the yardarm, light on the throttle," Skull told himself. "Haste makes waste." He had to approach calmly and slowly. He could not afford to spook the skittish animal. Without the horse, the dark men would soon run him to earth. The fact that he wore Tudwall's clothes was an advantage. The man's smell lingered in the filthy garments. He could plainly smell it, and no doubt the horse could too. "Bible and sword, that's good of you, boy," he said, walking slowly toward the horse. "Be a good nag now, be a good nag. You're an ugly nag, but I'll overlook that if you'll just carry me to Texas." The horse pawed the ground once, but did not retreat. Skull came on steadily and soon had the bridle rein in his hand. In another moment he had Tudwall's rifle out of its scabbard and was in the saddle. Then, to his intense annoyance, the horse began to crow-hop. Skull had no skill with broncos, as the Texans called bucking horses. He had to grab the horse's mane to keep from being thrown, and in the process, to his intense vexation, dropped the rifle. Finally, the crow-hopping stopped, but by then Skull was not sure where the rifle was. He saw a line of men on the horizon and knew that he had no time to search for the gun. He sawed the reins until he had the paint pointed north and then urged him into a dead run. "I'm gone," he thought, "I'm gone." But then he heard the whirl of bolas as the dark men rose up from behind a low ridge. The running horse went down hard. Skull flew a good distance and lit on his shoulder. As he rose, more bolas were flying at him. One wrapped around his legs. He quickly shot 2 of the dark men, but a third dashed in and hit him on the head with the flat side of a machete. The sky swirled above him as it might if he were on a fast carousel. This time Ahumado supervised the caging. The 3 other cages were pulled up and the pecked-at corpses in them flung over the cliff. Skull was put in the strongest cage. He was dazed from the blow to his head and made no resistance. Ahumado let him keep the clothes he had taken from Tudwall. "I have no one to put in these cages," the old man said. "You will be alone on the cliff." "It's a fine honor, I'm sure," Skull said. His head rang so that it was a chore to talk. "It is no honor, but it means that many birds will come to you. If you are quick, you can catch these birds. You might live a long time." "I'll be quick, but you ain't smart, senor," Skull said. "If you were smart, you'd ransom me. I'm a big Hefe. The Texans might give you 1,000 cattle if you'd send me back. Your people could live a good spell on 1,000 cattle," he added. Ahumado stepped close to the cage and looked at him with a look of such contempt that it startled Einish Skull. The look was like the slice of a machete. "Those are not my people, they are my slaves," Ahumado said. "Those cattle in Texas are mine already. They wandered there from Jaguar's land and parrots. When I want cattle, I go to Texas and get them." He stopped and stepped back. The force of his contempt was so great that Skull could not look away. "You had better try to catch those fat pigeons when they come to roost," the old man said. Then he gestured to the dark men and turned away. The dark men put their shoulders against the cage and nudged it outward over the lip of the great cliff. Slowly, the men who stood at the post began to lower it into the yellow canyon. The cage twisted a little as it was lowered. It twisted and swayed. Einish's skull held tightly to the mesquite bars. The height made him dizzy. He wondered if the rope would hold. Far below him, great black vultures soared and sank. One or two rose toward him as the cage was lowered, but most of them pecked at the remains of the corpses that had just been thrown off the cliff. Augustus McCrae, broken-hearted because of Clara's marriage, resorted much to the bottle or jug as the 6 rangers proceeded west in search of Captain Einish's skull. It was vexing to call, damn vexing. He was convinced they were on a wild goose chase anyway, trying to find one man in an area as large as West Texas, and a man besides who might not appreciate being found even if they did find him. "It's 2 men, Woodrow," Augustus reminded him. "Famous Shoes is with him." "Was with him. That was a while ago," Call said. "Are you too drunk to notice that time's passing?" They were riding through the sparsely grassed country near the double mountain fork of the Brazos, well beyond the rim of settlement. They had not even come upon a farm for over a week. All they saw ahead of them was deep sky and brown land. "I ain't drunk at all, though I would be if there was whiskey to be had in this country," Gus said. "I doubt if there's a jug of whiskey within 200 miles of here." "That's fine," Call said. "You were drunk enough to last you while it was available." "No, Woodrow, it didn't last," Gus said. "Maybe Clara didn't really marry. She likes a joke, you know. She might have just been joking to see what I'd do." Call didn't answer. The conjecture was too foolish to dignify. Augustus had lost his girl, and that was that. The other rangers were jolly, though, all except Long Bill, who had not expected to leave his pearl so soon. Imagining domestic delights that he was not at home to experience put Long Bill in a low mood. Young Jake Spoon, though, was so jolly that he was apt to be irritating. The mere fact that he had survived 2 weeks in the wilderness without being scalped or tortured convinced him that rangering was easy and himself immortal. He was apt to babble on endlessly about the most normal occurrence, such as killing an antelope or a cougar. The weather had been warm, which particularly pleased P.I. He did most of the camp chores with will and skill, whereas young Jake had adequate will but little skill. The 3rd morning out, he girthed Gus's young horse too tightly. Gus was too hungover to notice. He mounted and was promptly bucked off, a circumstance that didn't please him. He cussed young Jake thoroughly, plunging the young man into a state of deep embarrassment. Dietz, the black man, was the happiest and least troublesome member of the troop. Dietz liked being a scout far better than he liked being in town. The reason being, Call suspected, was because in town there were always men who might abuse him because of his color. "Why are you so darn hard to convince, Woodrow?" Gus asked. "I've known you forever, and I've never been able to convince you of a single thing." "No, you've convinced me of one thing for sure," Call said, "and that's that you're foolish about women. I expect Clara turned you down because she knew you were too fond of whores," he added. "Not a bit of it," Gus retorted. "She knew I'd give up whores in a minute if she'd marry me." Nonetheless, the thought that what Call said might be true made Augustus so unhappy that he wanted to get down and beat his head against a rock. They had only been in Austin 2 days. What happened with Clara happened so fast that when he thought back on it, it was more like a visit in a dream than something real. He wanted to believe that when they returned to Austin again, things would be as they had always been, with Clara in her father's store, unmarried, waiting for him to rush in and kiss her. Long Bill Coleman rode up to the 2 captains in hopes of getting some things clarified. He had quickly come to regret his gallantry in allowing himself to be conscripted for the new expedition. Adjusting to the racket of domestic life was hard for him after a long trip. It might have been a little quieter had Pearl not insisted on keeping her chickens in the kitchen, but Pearl couldn't stand to be parted from her chickens. So there was the racket to contend with, on top of which Pearl was a fervent woman who liked to make up his absences by lots of fervor, An overwhelming amount of fervor at times, in fact. Thus, Long Bill was subjected to conflicting feelings. Part of him wanted Pearl and her fervor, while another part longed for the peace of the prairies. For the moment, he seemed to have the peace of the prairies, though there was no guarantee that the peace would hold. Several times, moving west along the rivers and creeks, they had struck Indian sign, enough Indian sign to make Long Bill nervous. His opinion of the matter, now that he was too far west to do much about it, was that he ought to have stayed with his wife. The chickens, after all, could be tolerated. Better chickens than Comanches. "Shut up, Bill. I don't know where we are, and neither does Woodrow," Gus said when he saw Long Bill riding up, an interrogative look on his face. "I never asked a question," Long Bill pointed out. "No, but you were about to. I seen it in the way you was holding your mouth," Gus said. "I just wanted to know when we give up on finding the captain," Long Bill said. "I got chores to do at home." "You're a ranger, and that comes first," Gus said tartly. "Your wife's big and stout. She can do the confounded chores." "Well, but she's got a baby in her. That will slow some women down," Long Bill said. "Rather than arguing, we need to be paying attention to the trail," Call said. With Augustus in such an uncertain temper, he wanted to cool things before the argument became a fist fight. "What trail?" Gus said. "There's no trail. We're just following our noses, and our noses are pointed west." "That's what it looks like to me," Long Bill said. "Captain Skull's got clean away. When do we go back?" "I guess we'll go back when we've gone far enough," Call said, aware that it was no answer. "Well, but what's far enough?" Jake Spoon asked, thrusting himself into the conversation, and not for the first time either. P.I. Parker would never have intruded when his elders were talking. P.I. offered an opinion only when asked for one, which was seldom. He tried to determine correct procedure by watching his elders. Jake Spoon didn't think in terms of elders or superiors. It never occurred to him that there were times when the two captains might not want to be bothered with a youngster. Jake just barged in and asked his question. "We're not to the Pecos yet," Call said. "If we don't strike his trail between here and the Pecos, I expect we ought to go back." "I think we ought to look in Mexico myself," Augustus said. "Why?" Call said. "We had no orders to look in Mexico." "No, but there's whores and tequila in Mexico," Gus said. "Bill and me, we could drown our sorrows." "I ain't going all the way to Mexico just so you two can drown your sorrows," Call said. "Woodrow always changes the subject when the talk turns to women," Augustus said. "I didn't know the talk was even about women," Call said. "I thought we were talking about when to give up on the captain and go back home." Long Bill Coleman, to his own surprise and Call's, suddenly burst out with an opinion that he'd been holding in for months. "A man ought to marry, Captain," Long Bill said. "It's a lonely life not having no woman to hold on to, and you bunk down at night." Call was so startled by the remark that he hardly knew what to say. "I'm usually working at night, Bill. I don't spend much time in a bunk," he replied finally. Long Bill's Adam's apple was quivering and his face was red. Call had seen him fight several fierce engagements with the Comanches and exhibit less emotion. "I don't know that little Maggie Tilton too well, but I do know she wasn't meant to be no whore," Long Bill said. "She was meant to be a wife, and she'd make a fine one." Then, embarrassed by what he had said, he abruptly shut up and rode away. "Amen," Gus said. "Now, you see, Woodrow, the sooner you marry Maggie, the happier the rest of us will be." Call was amazed. Here they were in the middle of the wilderness on a dangerous assignment, and Long Bill Coleman, the solidest man in the troop, had seen fit to deliver a public lecture urging him to get married. Surely the decision to marry was a private matter that need only be discussed between the couple who were thinking of marrying. Worrying about it while patrolling the Double Mountain Fork of the Brazos struck him as highly inappropriate. It would only distract them from the business at hand, which was rangering. While on patrol, he liked to give his full attention to the landscape, the men, the horses, tracks, sign, the behavior of the birds and animals they spotted, anything that might help keep a troop of men alive in a country where a Comanche raiding party could swoop down on them at any moment. It was no time to be clouding the mind with issues of marriage or lustful thoughts, and the mention of slim Maggie Tilton did lead to lustful thoughts. Many a night on guard he had been distracted by the thought of Maggie, It was just good luck that he hadn't come under sudden attack at such a moment. Long Bill, embarrassed by his own impertinence, avoided call for the rest of the day. Augustus, as surprised by Long Bill's statement as call had been, thought it best to avoid the subject of marriage for the rest of the day. That evening, as soon as he'd had coffee and his bite, Call walked away from the campfire and sat by himself all night. "I doubt he'll marry her, Gus," Long Bill whispered to Gus McCrae. "I doubt it too," Gus said. "He ought to, though. You're right about that, Bill." In the middle of the next afternoon, they heard the crack of gunshots from some low rocky hills to the north. Then a dog bayed, a hound of some kind. They had just watered their horses at a thin trickle of creek with a few wild plum bushes scattered along it. While the horses were taking in water and the men relieving themselves of it, Dietz hurried up and down the little creek looking at the plum bushes. Of course, it was too early in the year for plums yet, but he liked to make note of such things in case they passed that way in June, when the sweet plums would be mature. When the shots rang out, Dietz came hurrying back. There were 2 shots, and then silence, except for the hound. Since the party was so small, Call and Augustus decided they had best stay together. They could not afford to send one man to scout. He might be surrounded and cut down. "That ain't a real hound," Augustus ventured. "It's a damn Comanche imitating a hound. They can imitate anything, you know, Indians can." All during his years as a ranger, Augustus had been prone to anxiety because of the Indians' well-known ability to perfectly mimic bird songs and animal sounds. He had never actually caught an Indian imitating a bird, but he knew they could. Long Bill Coleman shared this particular anxiety. "That's Indians for sure, Captain," he said. "They're trying to make us think there's a hound over in those rocks." Call didn't share the anxiety. Dietz himself could mimic several animals and most birds. He could perfectly imitate the snuff an armadillo makes when startled, and Dietz wasn't an Indian. Besides, there was an abundance of wildlife, birds and animals, that did an excellent job of making their own sounds. The ridge of shaly rock where the shots had come from looked uninviting, though. The ridge wrinkled the prairie for miles and could easily shelter an ambushing war party. "They're there, Woodrow," Augustus said. "They're just waiting till we get closer. Look to your weapons, boys." Young Jake Spoon was so terrified that he felt frozen. He put his hand on his pistol but was too scared to pull it out. If an Indian did come running at him, Jake felt the fright alone would kill him. He realized he had been wrong not to stay in town. He felt as good as dead and just hoped the termination would be as quick and painless as possible. "Well, if that's a Comanche, he not only sounds like a dog, he looks like a dog," Call said. A large gray hound had just appeared, trotting back and forth amid the rocks. Long Bill felt immediate relief. "Well, I know that dog," he said. "That's old Howler, Ben Lilly's dog. Ben probably shot a bear. That's all he does, shoot bears." "I doubt there's many bears out in this country," Gus said. "There's one less now. Ben Lilly, he's deadly on bears." The sight of the large gray dog dispelled the general apprehension. As they drew closer to the rocky ridge, the hound started howling again, a dismal sound, P.I. thought. He had never been overly fond of the canine breeds. Sure enough, when they clattered over the rocks that covered the ridge, they came upon a large, stooped man in buckskin clothes, skinning a young brown bear. The man's thick hair and long beard were evidently strangers to the comb or the brush. He favored them with a quick glance and then went on with his work. "Howdy, Mr. Lilly," Long Bill said. "What are you doing out here on the Baldies?" He had intended the remark to be jocular, but Ben Lilly took it literally. "Skinning a bear," he said. "That bear's not much bigger than a cub," Augustus said. "If his ma's around here, I expect she'll be wanting to eat us." "Shot her yesterday," Ben Lilly said. "Took us a day to catch up with the cub. Howler and me, that's us." Call thought the man looked daft. What use was a dead bear in a place so remote? Of course he could eat some of the meat, but why take the skin, which was heavy and awkward to transport? Where would he take it anyway? Yet the man seemed content at his task. He even began to whistle as he skinned, and he clearly had no interest in the Rangers. "Well, if you shot his ma, where's her skin?" Augustus asked. He, too, was puzzled by the skinning. How many bear skins could a man use? "Buried," Ben Lilly said, a little testily. "I bury skins. Then if I get caught in a blizzard, I can dig up one of my skins and wrap up." "You best be worrying about Indians, not blizzards, Mr. Lilly," Longbill said. "If Buffalo Hump was to catch you, I expect he'd throw you on a campfire and cook you." Ben Lilly disregarded that remark completely. He finished with his skinning and sat down on a rock. He plunged his hunting knife into the ground to cleanse it, then took out a whetstone and began to sharpen the knife. The fact that his task was concluded seemed to put him in a sociable mood. "You can have this bear meat," he informed them. "I don't eat much bear." Dietz had been hoping for such an offer. He immediately got down and began to inspect the carcass, meaning to secure the tenderest cuts. But what was tender on a bear? "We've been sent to look for Captain Einish's skull," Call said. "He was last seen going south with one scout. Have you seen or heard of him?" The name Skull seemed to excite the man. He looked at the group with interest for the first time. "I know Skull," Ben Lilly said. "Took on a hunt once over east. He wanted to shoot bear, and we shot him. One bear got into the cane brakes, and Skull crawled in after him and shot him. He was a small fella. He went right into that cane and shot that quick little bear." "That's him. He's a hunter," Augustus said. "We need to find him if we can." Ben Lilly was carefully folding the bloody bearskin. "Ain't seen Skull since that hunt over east," he said. "I'd know him if I seen him, but I ain't seen him. I expect they took him in the big raid." All the rangers were startled by the remark. "Big raid? What big raid?" Gus asked. Ben Lilly looked at them with genuine astonishment. "The big raid," he repeated. "Ain't you seen any dead? I buried 6 dead just yesterday back up this creek. 6 dead trying to farm where they oughtn't to farm. Took me all morning to bury 'em. I'd have caught this cub sooner if I hadn't had to do that burying." "We've been on the trail for 2 weeks," Call said. "We don't know anything about a raid. Was it Comanches?" "It was Buffalo Hump," Ben Lilly said. "He came down off the plains with a passel of warriors, 1,000 or more." 1,000 braves? "I doubt it," Call said. "People always think there's more Indians than there are when the Comanches attack." Ben Lilly hoisted his bearskin onto one shoulder and picked up his gun. Then he whistled for his dog. "Go east," he told him. "See how many dead you find. There's dead along every creek. I don't know how many men he came with, but he struck Austin and nearly burned it down. This wasn't just a few scalp snatchers. Buffalo Hump came for war, and he made it." All the rangers were stunned by his last statement. "Struck Austin? Are you sure?" Longbill said. "Struck it and burned most of it," Ben Lilly repeated. "Killed everybody he saw, that's what I heard." Then, without waiting for further comment or discussion, he took his gun and his bearskin and walked away. He took no more interest in the troop of rangers. "Do you believe him, Woodrow?" Longbill asked. "My wife's in Austin, my Pearl." "I don't know why he'd lie to us," Call said. "Clara," Gus said. "My lord, I wonder if she was gone when they struck." "I wonder if Maggie hid where I told her to," Call thought. "Woodrow, we have to go back," Augustus said. "If they burned Austin, Clara might be dead." Longbill remembered the captive they had rescued, Maudie Clark, now demented. What if the Comanches caught Pearl and left her in the same state? "Captain, let's go back," he said. Augustus looked across the emptiness they had just crossed. Now they would have to recross it, riding for days and days in great anxiety. "Lord, I wish I was a bird," Gus said. "I wish I could just fly home." "You ain't a bird, Gus," Call said. All the rangers, even Dietz, seemed stunned by Ben Lilly's news. An Indian force large enough to strike Austin and burn most of it was a calamity greater than they could immediately comprehend. Call felt stunned, too. The first time he and Augustus had gone into the Pecos country with a small surveying troop, 9 Comanches, led by Buffalo Hump, had attacked them, killed 3 men, and captured their ammunition. None of the 9 Comanches had been so much as grazed by a ranger bullet. If 1,000 warriors had indeed come into the settlements, there might be little to defend by the time they reached Austin. "You ain't a bird," he said again to Gus. "We can't fly it. We'll have to ride it. And we don't want to wear out these horses because horses won't be easy to find on the way back. Buffalo Hump's probably run off most of the horses from the ranches out this way." "I don't care about the darn horses. I just hope he ain't took my wife," Long Bill said. "Took her or killed her. I don't think I can do without my Pearl. I should never have left her not to come on no silly chase like this." Augustus, though heartsick himself, saw the anguish on Long Bill's face and thought if he joshed him a little it might help. "Now, Billy, don't worry," he said. "Pearl's too bossy to steal. She'd argue those Comanches to a frazzle. I expect she'll be there ready to boss you when we get back." The witticism had no effect. Long Bill looked no less anguished. The rangers sat in silence while Dietz finished taking what he hoped was tender cuts of the bear meat. "I guess Captain Skull will have to find his own way back," Call said, looking south. Then he turned his horse, and the little troop began the long ride home, every man wondering what they would find when they got there.